If anyone had told Richard Wallace, the billionaire CEO of Wallace Enterprises, that the person who would steal his heart would one day arrive at his mansion carrying a toolbox, smelling faintly of metal and grease, he would have laughed them out of the room. He was a man accustomed to luxury, surrounded by high society, admired by supermodels, and praised by politicians. Love, when it came, was supposed to be polished, glamorous, sophisticated and fitting of his wealth, or so people thought. But life, as Richard would soon discover, had other plans. Before we go on, I would like to kindly ask that you please subscribe to the channel, like the video as well, as I promise to deliver great and more interesting stories, and also drop a comment to support. I'd really appreciate. The story begins on a stormy Tuesday afternoon, when fate decided to play its cruel yet beautiful trick. Richard had been pacing the marble halls of his enormous estate, agitated that his private bathroom had broken down again. It wasn't just any bathroom. It was connected to his penthouse suite, and he made sure to use quality imported materials as he only dealt with expensive shit. He had called the maintenance company twice, but they hadn't sent anyone. Furious, he had demanded an immediate technician. That was how she arrived. Michelle Hayes, a young plumber in her late 20s, wearing faded jeans and a plain shirt, with rough hands that had seen years of honest work. Her boots were worn, her hair a little messy from the rain, and her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had already worked 3 jobs that day. She had no idea whose house she was walking into. To her, it was just another service call. To Richard, it was the beginning of a story that would upend his world. When the butler announced that the plumber had arrived, Richard frowned. He expected someone polished, more sophisticated at least, in a proper uniform, and definitely not a woman. Talk about women in men fields. Instead, Michelle walked in with her modest toolbox, nodding politely, not looking the least bit intimidated by the grandeur of the mansion. "Where's the problem?" Michelle asked, her voice firm but respectful. Richard, slightly offended by the lady's lack of deference, gestured toward the bathroom. "It keeps clogging. You'd think with all the money I paid for it, it wouldn't behave like this." Michelle knelt down, inspected the panel, and muttered under her breath, "Sometimes the most expensive things break the easiest." Richard narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to people making such casual remarks in his home, but something about the plumber's straightforwardness intrigued him. Everyone else tiptoed around him, careful with their words, desperate to impress. Michelle, on the other hand, seemed more focused on the job than the billionaire standing beside him. For the next hour, Richard found himself oddly mesmerized. He watched the plumber work, her strong hands moving with precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. Richard noticed the small details, the way Michelle wiped her hands before touching the polished surfaces, the way she double-checked her work instead of rushing, the way she refused the butler's offer of champagne, asking only for a glass of water. There was a quiet dignity about her, a kind of pride that wealth couldn't buy. When Michelle finally stood up, wiping her hands, she said simply, "It's fixed. Shouldn't give you trouble again if it's maintained properly. But I'd suggest you actually get a proper checkup of the whole system. Whoever installed it cut corners." Richard blinked. "Do you know how much the materials for that bathroom cost?" "I imported them myself." Michelle shrugged. "Doesn't matter how much it cost if it wasn't installed right. Money doesn't guarantee quality. Effort does." That single sentence struck Richard in a way he didn't expect. He paid Michelle for the service, far more than the woman asked for. But Michelle only accepted what was fair, politely refusing the extra. "I don't overcharge. That's my rule." And then just like that, Michelle packed up her tools and left, without lingering, without trying to curry favor, without even asking for a photo or recognition. Richard stood in the silence of his grand estate, oddly unsettled. For the first time in years, someone had walked into his world and walked out without being blinded by the glitter of his wealth. He couldn't stop thinking about her. That night, Richard found himself restless. He had everything a man could want: a mansion, luxury cars, private jets. Yet the image of the female plumber lingered stubbornly in his mind. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was Michelle's refusal to be dazzled by wealth. Perhaps it was the confidence in her voice when she spoke of effort over money. Or perhaps it was that brief, unspoken moment when their eyes met, and Richard had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity grew into obsession. The next morning, Richard asked his assistant to pull the file on the plumbing company, but instead of contacting them directly, he drove himself, something he rarely ever did, to the small workshop Michelle ran on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the world Richard was used to. The workshop was modest, with rusted metal shelves, spare parts scattered around, and an old wooden desk with invoices stacked high. Yet, there was a warmth to it. 2 children, perhaps clients' kids, were playing outside, laughing as Michelle fixed a broken pipe near the entrance. When Michelle saw him, she didn't look shocked. She didn't bow or scramble to offer special treatment. She simply wiped her hands and asked, "Something wrong with the bathroom again?" Richard smirked. "No, I wanted to thank you properly, and maybe ask you a question." Michelle raised an eyebrow, but nodded toward the desk. "All right, I've got 10 minutes. For a man who owned skyscrapers, it was the first time Richard had ever been given time instead of commanding it. He sat down awkwardly, feeling out of place. "What drives you?" Richard asked suddenly. Michelle frowned. "Excuse me, you could have taken the extra money I offered. You could have used my name to get more clients. But you didn't. Most people I meet, they want something. Yet you don't. Why?" Michelle leaned back, crossing her arms. "Because dignity doesn't have a price tag. My father was a plumber. He died young. Taught me one thing. Do honest work, treat people fairly, and never sell your soul for quick gain. That's all." Richard sat in silence. It was such a simple philosophy, yet it felt revolutionary compared to the ruthless greed of the world he inhabited. As the days passed, Richard found excuses, or perhaps reasons, to keep returning. Sometimes it was a leaking faucet at his mansion. Sometimes a burst pipe in one of his company's properties. Other times, he didn't even bother with an excuse. He would show up at the workshop with coffee, insisting on helping Michelle with small tasks. Slowly, a friendship bloomed. Michelle, at first cautious, began to open up. Richard learned that Michelle lived with her younger sister, Clara, who was studying nursing while she worked tirelessly to support them. Their parents had passed away years earlier, leaving Michelle as the guardian. Life had been cruel, but she carried her burdens with a quiet strength that Richard couldn't help but admire. It was during one of these visits that Richard found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in years. They had been fixing a stubborn pipe together, both covered in grease, when Michelle cracked a dry joke about how billionaires were useless without plumbers. Richard's deep laugh startled even himself. For a fleeting moment, there were no titles, no wealth, no gap between them. A man and women, side by side, finding joy in the simplest of things. But the world outside was not so forgiving. One evening, Richard invited Michelle to a charity gala. Michelle declined at first, but Richard insisted, saying it would be good exposure for her business. Reluctantly, Michelle agreed, borrowing an old suit that barely fit. The moment they walked in, whispers started. The high society crowd stared at the rugged plumber beside the billionaire. Some chuckled behind champagne glasses, others sneered openly. One socialite even whispered loudly, "Did he pick her off the street?" Richard noticed the discomfort on Michelle's face. For the first time, Michelle looked out of place. But Richard, surprising even himself, took Michelle's hand in a firm grip and introduced her to every influential person in the room. "This is Michelle Hayes," Richard said proudly. "The most skilled and honest woman I've ever worked with. Very handy and probably stronger than a lot of you all." He laughed it off as a joke. The crowd was stunned, but Richard didn't care. That night, after the gala, Michelle confronted him. "Why would you do that? You embarrassed me. I don't belong in your world." Richard looked at her earnestly. "Maybe you don't belong in their world, but you belong in mine." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with words neither of them dared to speak. It was the beginning of something neither could ignore. After that night, something shifted. Richard found himself battling feelings he had long buried. He had dated women before, models, actresses, socialites, all chosen for their beauty, status, or political advantage. Yet none of them had left him restless at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation the way Michelle did. Michelle, however, seemed determined to keep a distance. She became more formal, speaking less when Richard visited. She worked longer hours, sometimes even avoiding Richard's calls. At first, Richard thought it was irritation, but one evening when Richard caught him alone, sitting by the workshop after closing, he realized it was something else entirely. Michelle's eyes carried a weight. "You've got to stop coming here," Michelle said quietly, not looking at him. Richard froze. "Why?" "Because people are talking. My sister, she hears things. Neighbors whisper. They think I'm chasing your money. They think I'm trying to trap you." "And what do you think?" Richard asked. Michelle finally met his gaze, and her voice was steady. "I think this, whatever this is dangerous. For you, for me. We're from two different worlds, Richard. Men, like, you don't end up with women like me. They end up watching from afar as you marry someone from your circle. Someone with a name and a fortune. That's the truth." Richard's chest tightened. For a man who had built empires, controlled boardrooms, and silenced rivals, he suddenly felt powerless. He couldn't command Michelle's heart the way he commanded his company's. He left that night with a storm raging inside him. Rumors began to spread faster. A tabloid published a photo of Richard and Michelle leaving the gala together, with the headline, "Woman, who is she?" Within days, gossip columns exploded. Some speculated Michelle was Richard's secret project manager. Others went as far as calling her a lover. The business world didn't stay silent either. At a board meeting, one of Richard's senior partners hinted at the issue. "The company's reputation depends on appearances, Richard. Associating too closely with certain people could be damaging." Richard dismissed it outwardly, but the words lingered. That evening, he drove to Michelle's home unannounced. Clara, Michelle's younger sister, answered the door. She was wary but polite, ushering him in. The modest living room smelled faintly of fresh bread, and children's toys were scattered across the floor. Clara's two kids. Richard watched as Michelle emerged from the kitchen, apron tied around her waist, sleeves rolled up. For a billionaire used to maids and chefs, the image of Michelle cooking for his family struck something deep within him. "I told you to stop coming," Michelle said firmly. "And I told you," Richard replied, equally firm, "that I don't care what the world thinks." Michelle's jaw tightened, but Clara stepped in, her tone softer. "Richard, I don't know what your intentions are with my sister, but I do know she's worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to become the subject of society's games. If you truly care about her, prove it in a way that doesn't destroy her." Richard left that night with her words echoing in his head. Weeks passed. The gossip didn't die down, it grew. Clients whispered. Investors pressed Richard with subtle threats. Meanwhile, Michelle continued to pull away, determined to shield herself and her sister from further humiliation. But Richard had made up his mind. At a lavish corporate event where reporters swarmed, Richard stood at the podium, preparing to give a speech about his company's latest venture. The cameras flashed, executives leaned forward, and the world waited. And then he said it. "I know the press has had much to say about me lately. They've speculated about my love life, my personal life. Tonight, I'll save them the trouble. The woman you've all been talking about, Michelle Hayes, is not a rumor. She is someone I have grown to love, and I am proud to say it." The room erupted. Some gasped, others muttered in shock. The board members looked horrified, but Richard felt a strange calmness as he stepped away from the podium. For once, he hadn't spoken for shareholders or politicians. He had spoken for himself. Michelle, who was watching from home, nearly dropped the glass she was holding. She stared at the television screen, heart pounding, unable to breathe. Grown to love? Me? Richard had just risked everything. His empire, his reputation, his wealth for her. That night, Richard showed up at Michelle's door once more. Michelle opened it slowly, still stunned. Why would you do that? You could lose everything. Richard stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Because none of it means anything if I don't have someone real beside me. And you, Michelle, you're the realest person I've ever met. For the first time, Michelle didn't push him away. And in that moment, the line between two worlds blurred. Richard's bold declaration spread like wildfire. By morning, every major outlet carried the story. Billionaire comes out with low-class lover. Richard Sterling chooses love over fortune. Mystery plumber revealed. Some praised his courage. Others mocked him. Shareholders panicked. Politicians pulled back. And one of Richard's biggest investors threatened to withdraw hundreds of millions. But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't care. Still, the storm came knocking at Michelle's door. Her workshop was vandalized with hateful graffiti. Gold digger. User. Disgrace. A few neighbors stopped speaking to her. And Clara even got harassed at the market. Her 2 children came home crying after hearing kids repeat the cruel words their parents whispered. Michelle reached her breaking point. One evening, she sat across from Richard in silence, her hands trembling. I can't do this, Richard. My family doesn't deserve this. I don't deserve this. Look at what they've done already. And this is just the beginning. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Listen to me, Michelle. I've spent years fighting battles in boardrooms. I've faced men who would rather see me bankrupt than breathing. And I've won every time. If I could fight for billions, don't you think I can fight for you? For us? Michelle's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the fear was real. Still, deep down, she couldn't deny what Richard's eyes confessed every time they looked at her. Love. Just when things seemed unbearable, Richard's estranged father, Edward Sterling, reappeared. Edward had always been a controlling figure, more concerned with legacy than family. He had disowned Richard years ago for refusing to marry a wealthy heiress. Now, sensing weakness, he showed up at Richard's office. I warned you, son, Edward said, slamming the newspaper down on the desk. Sterling men don't throw away dynasties over feelings. You're destroying everything I built. Richard stood tall, his tone icy. You didn't build this. I did. And I won't apologize for loving a woman who makes me human. Edward sneered. You call that a woman? No respectable lady will do such disgusting job as a plumber. That plumber will ruin you. Walk away now and maybe you'll still have something left to rebuild. But Richard didn't flinch. I'd rather lose everything than live the kind of hollow life you call success. Edward stormed out, but his words left a shadow. For all Richard's bravado, he knew his father still had connections that could hurt him. The weeks that followed were brutal. Lawsuits emerged, clients cut ties, and board members voted to oust Richard as CEO. In one crushing meeting, he was stripped of his position in the very company he founded. When he came home that night, Michelle saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Richard had always looked untouchable, larger than life. But now he looked human. You lost everything, Michelle whispered. No, Richard said softly, sitting beside her. I lost money, titles, buildings, but you're here. That means I've gained everything that matters. Michelle's heart broke. She had tried to push Richard away, to protect him. Yet Richard had chosen her, again and again, even when it cost him everything. And for the first time, Michelle allowed himself to lean into Richard's embrace, no longer resisting. Months passed. Life was simpler now. Richard no longer lived in sprawling mansions. He had moved into Michelle's modest home. At first, it was an adjustment, no butlers, no fleets of cars, no private chefs. But strangely, Richard found peace in the simplicity. He learned how to fix a leaky tap from Michelle, how to grocery shop with Clara, how to sit on a porch and watch kids play without a phone buzzing every second. Michelle, too, began to realize something. Richard wasn't just a billionaire stripped of wealth. He was a man who had finally found freedom. freedom to live, to laugh, to love. One quiet evening, as they shared dinner with Clara and her children, Richard cleared his throat. The kids giggled as he struggled to get everyone's attention. Then, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Michelle's eyes widened. "Michelle Hayes," Richard said, voice unsteady but filled with emotion. "You show me more love, strength, and truth than I've ever known. I don't have a boardroom or titles, or even the empire I once did. But what I do have is a heart that belongs completely to you. Will you marry me?" The room fell silent. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. Her children clapped, not fully understanding but sensing the joy. Michelle covered her mouth, overwhelmed. For years, she had believed men like Richard belonged to another world, one unreachable, untouchable. Yet here he was, stripped of riches, offering nothing but love. "Yes," Michelle whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will." The wedding wasn't in a cathedral or a grand hall. It was in Clara's backyard, under strings of fairy lights, with neighbors gathered, children laughing, and the scent of homemade food in the air. Richard wore a simple suit. Michelle wore the biggest smile of her life. The world had once scoffed at them, but now, standing hand in hand, they realized the world didn't matter. What mattered was this: a billionaire who had gained everything, yet found meaning only when he lost it all, and a humble plumber who showed him that true wealth was not counted in dollars or gold, but in love that withstands fire.